첫 번째 강연은 예일대학 종교학과의 그린 교수님께서 해주시겠습니다. 그린 교수님은 2012년에 미국의 캘리포니아 대학 UC 버클리에서 중국 초기 불교의 선정과 참회, 관상 체험에 관한 연구로 박사학위를 받았고 2015년부터 예일대학에서 재직 중이십니다. 중국사에서 중세 전기, 중국사에서는 이제 한 나라가 끝나면서부터 삼국시대부터 보통 중세 미디벌이라고 하고 당나라까지를 미디벌이라고 보는데요. 후한부터 한 위진남북조 시대까지 불교 문헌과 불교사에 대한 전문가 있습니다. 인도 불교와 중국 재래 문화의 교류를 통해서 중국적인 불교가 어떻게 형성되었는가에 대해 활발한 연구를 펼쳐오셨습니다. 불교 미술과 불교 문헌 및 불교의 종교 행위의 관련성에 대해서도 깊은 관심을 기울여 오셨습니다. 현재 초기 중국 불교사 연구에서 세계적으로 가장 돋보이는 중견 연구자라고 해도 과언이 아닙니다. 2021년에 책 2권이 나왔는데요. 하나가 Secrets of Buddhist Meditation, 선정하고 같은 말이죠. 그래서 Visionary Meditation Text, 바로 선경 같은 걸 나타내는 거고요. From Early Medieval China라고 하는 책을 쓰셨고요. 또 하나가 앞에서 말씀드린 것 같은 Chan Before Chan, 그러니까 선종 이전의 선으로 Meditation, Repentance and Visionary Experience in Chinese Buddhism이라고 하는 책을 내셨습니다. 현재는 중국 초기 불교의 역경과 커멘트리, 주소의 편찬 활동에 관한 연구 프로젝트를 진행 중이십니다. 원래 대학에서는 수학을 전공하셨고요. 16살인가 17살 때쯤에 불교에 관심이 생겨서 불교로 입문하게 되셨다고 들었습니다. 오늘은 그동안의 연구의 기초에서 깨달음의 경험을 중심으로 불교의 텍스트와 불교미술의 이미지의 관계에 대해서 먼저 살펴보고, 이어서 시각을 통한 수행이 어떻게 미술을 활용하고 또 수행을 통해 내면에 생성된 이미지들이 어떻게 미술에 재현되었는가 하는 문제에 대해서 말씀해 주시겠습니다. 큰 박수로 우리 그린 교수님을 환영해 주시죠.
Good afternoon. It is a great honor to be here with you today, and let me begin by extending my deep thanks to the Lee&Won Foundation for the invitation, and also to Professor Ri, who helped facilitate it. To be honest, I'm rather apprehensive to be here before you, although this set of lectures is supposed to be about Buddhist art. As was said in the introduction, I am not primarily a scholar of Buddhist art. I am primarily a scholar of Buddhist texts, that is to say, words, not images. Still, Buddhist art has always been something I'm very interested in, and in my research on the practices of Buddhist meditation, which is what I'll be talking about today, I have often found it helpful to consider Buddhist art as a parallel body of material outside of written texts that helps us understand how Buddhism has been thought about and practiced over time. So before the primary part of my talk, allow me to begin with just a brief example of this. So please consider the question of the posture of Buddhist meditation, or dhyana. Now, representations of this posture are very common in Buddhist art, and this is not surprising. After all, it was by practicing dhyana that the Buddha became the Buddha, we are told, making this posture a key symbol of the Buddha's awakening. And of course, within the Buddhist tradition, the practice of meditation is something that is strongly associated with the most advanced Buddhist practitioners. Yet, interestingly, when we look to early Indian Buddhist texts, the posture for dhyana is not explained particularly clearly. Early Indian Buddhist texts say only that one should sit with legs crossed. The first Buddhist texts to give more details than this, for example, such as how to position one's hands in the dhyana mudra, are in fact Chinese meditation texts from the 5th century, which I will be discussing more later. The instructions for the dhyana posture in these later Chinese texts are also curious in at least one way. These texts say that the meditator should form the dhyana mudra by placing their left hand on top of their right hand, and this becomes the standard instruction for meditation posture in East Asia. In Indian images of the dhyana posture, however, we see something different. Although there are some exceptions, usually the dhyana mudra, like in this image here, shows the right hand on top of the left hand. Or another early example here, showing a similar posture from early era of Indian Buddhist art. On the other hand, early Chinese images mostly agree with Chinese meditation texts. This has been pointed out, or as has been pointed out rather, by the art historian Nicoletta Celli prior to the introduction of tantric or esoteric Buddhist iconography in the 7th century. East Asian dhyana mudras, with only a few exceptions, typically place the left hand on top, as you see here. This is true even in the very earliest Buddhist images from China from the 3rd and 4th centuries, such as this bronze image here, which is to say much earlier than the earliest meditation texts that describe this posture. Now, this discrepancy was eventually noticed in China. Around the year 650, an Indian Buddhist teacher living in China named Buddhapalita gave a lecture on the practice of meditation, which is preserved in a text called The Essential Instructions for Meditation. And in this lecture, he gave precise instructions for the meditation posture. Buddhapalita here, as you can see in this passage, specifically says that the right hand should go on top of the left hand. And moreover, he also says that he has always wondered why in China it was done the other way around, which he says was wrong. So according to Buddhapalita then, the Chinese Buddhists had distorted the proper Indian meditation posture. However, when we turn to Buddhist art, we can see that this critique is not quite correct, because it is not just Chinese images that use a dhyana mudra with the left hand on top. Most images from Central Asia are also like this, as seen in this image here from the sort of Western Silk Roads in the 5th century. This we find in images from throughout Central Asia, though, again, there are some exceptions. Moreover, it seems that this version of the dhyana mudra was standard in Central Asia from a very early date. These paintings here, which are quite fragmentary, were recovered from the site of Karadong, which is near to Khotan, along the southern Silk Road. They were uncovered in 1991 by the Sino-French expedition to this site, and they have been radiocarbon dated to the first half of the 3rd century, making them probably some of the earliest known examples of Buddhist art from Central Asia. It's quite difficult to say very much about these images, of course, because they are so fragmentary, but clearly, as you can see, in each case, they show a dhyana mudra with the left hand on top. This, by the way, is another very early image that I found recently from the site of Lolan, also in the 3rd century, with this wooden image, which is a little harder to see because it's so worn, although if you look at the sort of line of the ridge here, you can see that this one, too, seems to have the left hand on top. Now, my story here about the dhyana mudra and its changes between India and Central Asia and China, this is a very tentative sketch for now, and I hope that a real art historian someday, that is to say not myself, will give a more complete picture of this. But I give this as an example to you just to make two simple observations. First is the relatively basic but still important point that Buddhist art can shed unique light on important areas of the history of Buddhist practice. If we only had Buddhist texts, like this one I showed you a moment ago, we might conclude that Chinese Buddhists, and actually East Asian Buddhists, had misunderstood the proper Indian meditation posture. But the evidence from Buddhist art shows us that there was indeed some kind of change, but that this change must have first occurred in Central Asia, not in China. This is not a trivial point. It suggests, for example, that the most immediate models for Buddhist meditation in China, in real life and in art, may have mostly come from Central Asia, not from India proper. In the case of a meditation practice, this would be a bit different from what our normal historical sources tell us. Now, historians of Chinese Buddhism do often think that Central Asian Buddhist practices were very important in the formation of Chinese Buddhism, but it's often quite difficult to demonstrate this conclusively because we do not have very many early Central Asian Buddhist texts. But the case of meditation posture here is perhaps one small example where we can have some kind of confidence about this point. Now, my second point that I want to make before I begin the sort of main subject of my lecture is a more theoretical one. As I have said, Buddhist texts rarely describe the meditation posture in detail, but Buddhist art, of course, shows it very frequently. And this, I think, is not just by chance. It is because when meditation is represented in art, the posture must be shown. But texts, even meditation texts, do not have to do this. They can, and often do, simply say, sit in the meditation posture. The point here is a general one that we should keep in mind when thinking about the relationship between Buddhist texts and Buddhist art, namely that these two media have different constraints. And these constraints bring about certain consequences. Texts can leave the posture of meditation to the imagination or to the instructions of, say, a living teacher. Images of the meditating Buddha cannot. Now, in my talk today, I'm going to discuss something kind of like the reverse of this situation. A situation where something central to Buddhist meditation was very difficult to depict visually, namely the internal aspects of meditation. What I'm going to suggest is that certain developments in the theory and practice of meditation during the first few centuries of the Common Era, developments that gave seeing and vision more importance, that these developments were in some way connected with concerns that Buddhist artists also had about how one might make the profound experiences produced by meditation visible. Now, the first thing I want to note about this is that this issue was potentially a problem for early Buddhist art. The most profound meditative experience within Buddhism is, of course, the one achieved by the Buddha at the moment of his awakening. This moment, as you may know, is usually depicted in Buddhist art through the scene of the so-called attack of Mara, when Mara's armies attack the meditating Buddha, and the corresponding posture of the so-called bhumisparsa, or earth-touching mudra, that the Buddha supposedly made at this moment. Now, how does this representation of the Buddha's awakening compare to what we see in Buddhist texts? Although there are many different versions in texts about the awakening of the Buddha, it is always very closely associated with the practice of meditation, dhyana. In the Mahasachaka Sutta of the Pali Canon, which is one of the earliest texts to describe the Buddha's awakening, the path to awakening is presented as a path using dhyana, and presented as a path that is an alternative to the path of self-inflicted pain that the Buddha had first tried. After the Buddha reached the sort of pinnacle of this exertion, which is famously depicted in Buddhist art through this image of the fasting Buddha, he realized that this was not the proper path to awakening. He then remembered that when he was a youth, he had once spontaneously entered the state of dhyana while he was resting in the shade of a tree. This state, he now remembers, was free of impurity, but was also pleasant, not painful. This, he decides, must be the path to awakening. And as you may know, this moment of the so-called first meditation of the Buddha while he was still a prince became an important theme in early Gandharan art from India. And many scholars believe that this image of the so-called Bodhisattva meditating, that is the Buddha before he was a Buddha, may have been one of the first kinds of images of the Buddha that were made. In any event, according to the story of the Mahasachaka Sutta, the Buddha then eats to recover his strength, and he begins to practice dhyana, and quickly reaches the highest such state, the so-called fourth dhyana. The details of this are not important for my story here. His mind having been purified, he then attains the so-called three vidya, or knowledges. In the first vidya, he is able to remember his past lives. In the second, he is able to know how all beings are reborn according to their karma. And finally, he attains the so-called third vidya, which is called the destruction of the defilements. And this is the actual moment of the Buddha's awakening. Now, the content of this final moment, what is happening in the Buddha's mind here, is described differently in different texts. In the Mahasachaka Sutta, which I've been sort of summarizing here, it is said that the Buddha at this moment realized the Four Noble Truths. In some texts, it says what he realized here is something else, the doctrine of a dependent origination, or pratitya samutpada. Either way, the basic point is that at this moment, the Buddha experiences a profound understanding of the highest abstract truths of Buddhism. And it's this understanding that liberates him. Now, note that in the Mahasachaka Sutta, which I've said is probably one of the earliest versions of this story, the attack and defeat of Mara is not part of the story at all. The earliest Buddhist texts do contain stories about Mara's trying to bother the Buddha, but they are not explicitly connected with the moment of awakening. Mara's attack and defeat does eventually become part of the written versions of the awakening story, but even when this happens, Mara's defeat is not usually equivalent to the moment of awakening itself. Rather, after Mara has been defeated by the Buddha then enters dhyana, and only at this point does he reach awakening, as I have just described it through the so-called three vidya. Most written versions of this story that we have from India clearly separate these two events. Just to take an example, in the Buddha Charita by Ashvaghosha, which is one of the most famous Sanskrit versions of the life of the Buddha, the attack of Mara and then the awakening each have their own chapter, separate. Now, early Indian Buddhist artists did also depict other famous events that took place close in time to the awakening. There was, for example, this scene, the so-called request of Brahma, the episode in which the god Brahma begs the newly awakened Buddha to teach rather than just sit in meditation. The request of Brahma is a very old part of the awakening story. It appears even in the early versions from the Pali Sutras that I have been mentioning, where the attack of Mara does not yet appear. Early artistic depictions of the scene, such as this one here, again from Gandhara, similarly put the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, seen here through the leaves, showing its connection to the moment of awakening. So early artistic depictions of the awakening thus seem, to me, to present us with a certain conundrum. There were several relevant scenes that artists conventionally made, such as the attack of Mara or the request of Brahma, although there may be others that are relevant as well here. But no matter what, if we try to locate the moment of the Buddha's awakening as it is described in texts, this moment is absent. Narratively, it is not in any of these scenes, but between them. There is, moreover, a kind of inverse relationship between this pictorial absence and the enormous volume of texts and words that Buddhist doctrinal literature devotes to describing the internal psychological qualities of the awakening itself and their moment-by-moment progression. This forms a major sort of subgenre of Buddhist doctrinal literature. Now, perhaps we might explain this absence of visual depictions of the awakening proper as a kind of taboo among Buddhist artists. But I am not sure that we need that kind of complicated explanation. It's probably simpler just to observe that the actual moment of awakening, as described in texts, is simply not that easy to depict. In the Mahasachaka Sutta, as I mentioned a moment ago, the moment of awakening is said to be when the Buddha realizes the Four Noble Truths. And here now, just to quote from that text, he directly knew, as it really is, this is suffering. This is the origin of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. And this is the path leading to the cessation of suffering. Now, how exactly would one depict this in art? Even the attainments of the four dhyanas, as they are described in the awakening story and in other places in early Buddhist texts, would be quite hard, I think, to show in pictures, because the qualities of these meditative states, the qualities of dhyana, are defined primarily in psychological terms, not in terms of anything that is externally visible in any normal way. I think that the Buddhist tradition was in some way aware of this issue and sometimes tried to find ways around it. That is to say, to find ways to make the awakening itself visible. In many of the later narrative stories about the Buddha's awakening, for example, the attack of Mara assumes an increased importance. This is the case in the perhaps earliest complete biography of the Buddha in the Pali tradition, the so-called Nidana Katha, which probably dates to the early Common Era. Here, the awakening proper still is said to take place through the three knowledges, the three vidya, and the meditative understanding of abstract doctrinal truths. However, that part of things is described in only a very short paragraph, while the attack of Mara is given many pages and great detail. A somewhat different situation occurs in the biography of the Buddha found in the so-called Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya, which is a major source for North Indian Buddhism during the early centuries of the Common Era. In this story, as usual, the awakening occurs through the three vidya and takes place after the attack and defeat of Mara. However, there is a single short sentence that is included in the text immediately after the full awakening. Mara is here mentioned again, and it says that, here I quote, "The bow fell from Mara's hands, his banner collapsed, his abode shook, his armies were saddened and depressed and remorseful and left." Now, notice what has happened here. With this brief line, the awakening itself is now positioned in between Mara's attack on the one hand, and then this brief mention of his retreat on the other hand. This immediately recalls the depictions of Mara's attack that occur in art, as here in this Gandharan image, right, where the Buddha is in the middle, Mara's armies are attacking on the left and retreating on the right. This iconography of the attack of Mara, with sort of the armies attacking and retreating, is very old. We see it here, for example, in some set of famous images from the so-called Great Stupa at Sanchi, which was built by King Ashoka in India, and which contains more or less the oldest examples of Indian Buddhist figural art that we have. In this image, as you can see, the Buddha is represented in the middle of the scene only by a tree, the Bodhi tree. And this is characteristic of the earliest Indian Buddhist images. Here Mara's armies attacking and then retreating. In all of their forms, the iconography in these scenes, on the one hand, of course, is some sort of attempt to represent the action of the scene. Mara's armies attack and retreat. What I want to note, though, is that if our reference point is the version of the awakening story that I just mentioned from the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya, what takes place in between the attack and retreat is the awakening proper. To be clear, I am not trying to say that this iconography of the Mara's attack and retreat was created based on this story from the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya. Probably we should see the influence the other way around. Probably the addition of this one little paragraph here at the end is something that was a literary adaptation to the story, created in a context where this kind of iconography was already well known. I know of at least one other rather isolated example that I would interpret as an attempt to make the awakening more visible within this iconography of the attack of Mara. An attempt that moves us in a slightly different direction. This quite wonderful painting here of the scene of the attack of Mara is from the so-called Peacock's Cave from the Kizil Grottos, which are located on the northern Silk Roads near to the site of Kucha. This cave originally contained a number of paintings showing major events in the Buddha's life. The dating of these images from the different Kizil caves is somewhat controversial still, as I understand it, but roughly we can say this painting dates to sometime between roughly the years 300 and 600. I should also say this painting, along with many of these other scenes of the life of the Buddha from this cave, were taken to Berlin and then sadly destroyed during World War II, so all we have left of them are these photographs. Now, in this painting, again, showing Mara's attack and retreat and the Buddha's awakening here with the earth-touching gesture, I draw your attention to the flames or light emerging from the Buddha's shoulders. Images of flame or light emerging from the shoulders of the Buddha, or sometimes from the Buddha's disciples, is usually understood to depict the so-called fire samadhi, tejo dhatu samadhi, as it's described in texts. And there are various stories in Buddhist texts about the Buddha entering this particular meditative state, and some of these stories are also depicted in art. In general, though, this motif seems to have been used in a relatively conventional way to indicate the great magical power of either Buddhas or Arhats. But the presence of this motif here in a scene of the attack and defeat of Mara is somewhat unusual, I believe. But amazingly, this element, too, has an exact counterpart in the same Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya text that I was mentioning, where just before the final line describing Mara's last retreat, it says that the Buddha attained to the fire element, tejo dhatum samapana. Now, the Buddha attaining to the fire element is definitely not a normal part of the story of the Buddha's awakening. And I myself am not at all sure whether this idea entered the textual tradition first and then came to appear in art, or if it was rather the other way around. The point I'm interested in making here is not about that, but is simply to say that this element of the story has made the moment of awakening more visible. Moreover, this visibility is not merely a matter of a temporal identification of the attack and defeat of Mara with the awakening. What has been here made visible in a still limited way is also some part of what we could call the internal content of the Buddha's meditative attainment, his having attained to the fire element, as it is said in the text. So this now brings me to the heart of my talk, which concerns the development within Buddhism during the early years of the Common Era of new ways of thinking about the kinds of experiences that Buddhist meditation produces. These changes involve the introduction of concrete visual imagery into the written descriptions of dhyana and its attainment. What I'm going to suggest is that these changes made advanced states of Buddhist meditation visible in new ways, and that this had at least some ramifications in Buddhist art. Now, I do not have time, of course, to discuss with you the entire history of Buddhist meditation, so let me just summarize a few basic things. Firstly, the earliest descriptions of dhyana in Indian Buddhist literature, including those in the stories of the Buddha's awakening, are all relatively vague and abstract. Early Indian Buddhist literature uses a number of stock or formulaic phrases to describe the attainment of dhyana. The so-called first dhyana, the first of these, the description goes something like this, and I'll just read this passage here, which you can read along with. When the 5 hindrances have left the meditator, gladness arises in him. From gladness comes delight. From the delight in his mind, his body becomes tranquil. With a tranquil body, he feels joy. And with joy in his mind is concentrated. Being in this way detached from desires and detached from unwholesome states, he enters and remains in the first dhyana, which is characterized by applied and sustained thought and filled with delight and joy born of detachment. Now, one thing to notice about this passage, of course, is that it does not say very much concretely about how one might reach this state of dhyana. The other thing to notice is that the attainment of dhyana here is described primarily in what I would call psychological terms, as a state of internal mental tranquility and joy. What someone who has entered this state might look like from the outside is entirely unclear. Now, there are some early sources that do explain the actual methods for entering dhyana. For example, it is said that if a meditator is troubled by the defilement of hatred, he should enter dhyana by bringing to mind love, maitri, which is the mental quality that opposes hatred. Or if he is troubled by a distracted mind, he should focus the mind on the breath, so-called mindfulness of breathing. These concrete methods for entering the meditative state of dhyana eventually become systematized in Buddhist literature into meditation texts that were composed in the centuries after the Buddha's death. And among these methods, there does appear to have been at least one that from an early date had some connection to the world of vision or visualization. This was the method of meditating on the impurity of the body, the Ashubha Bhavana. The earliest sources say that one should do this by bringing to mind a dead body at various stages of decomposition, and then to consider that one's own body has the same nature. However, from an early date, there also appeared instructions for carrying out this practice by way of a sort of step-by-step visualization. In this text, the Mahavibhasha, which is an important source for the Sarvastivada tradition, this is explained as follows. The meditator should go to a place with dead bodies, view the corpse in various stages of decay. Having grasped the image of the corpse, the meditator goes back and sits in a single place and brings to mind that image. It is then explained in the text that the meditator should focus his attention on this internal image until reaching a state of dhyana. Now, it's of great interest for the topic of my talk today that there eventually appeared, it seems, the idea that a meditator, in order to carry out this practice, might use, instead of an actual dead body, a painting or other constructed image of a dead body instead. This is mentioned casually in a number of sources, suggesting that these paintings must have been at least somewhat common. Very few actual images of this survive, however. We can get one small example, perhaps, of what these paintings were like from a quite amazing example that was preserved in the ruins of a monastery near the city of Hada, at the site of Tape Shotor in Afghanistan, which was discovered in the 1970s, in a cave that was attached to the ruins of the monastery there. This is what the cave kind of looks like. Again, this cave was also destroyed later by the Taliban, I believe, and so we only have some photographs of it. Now, notice the iconic positioning of the image of this skeleton here, centered on the wall at the end of the chamber, in a place where one might expect an image of the Buddha, for example. The viewer here is directly confronted with the skeleton as the focus of their attention. Note also the two monks to the sides of the skeleton, who are identified by inscriptions as Maudgalyayana and Shariputra, two of the Buddha's most famous disciples. Notice also that the monks themselves, to judge from their hand positioning, are not themselves meditating on this skeleton. Rather, they are preaching to the viewer, to us. So here then, the words that from within Buddhist literature describe how one should visualize the dead body, in this case the skeleton, have here been transformed into a visual image that one should presumably gaze at as a means of internalizing the image. Now, much more could be said about how these sort of early visualization methods developed in Buddhism. For one thing, the technique of entering dhyana by viewing an external object and then generating an image of it internally, this was eventually connected to other meditation practices. In some of the Chinese texts from the 5th century that I'll discuss in a few moments, for example, we find instructions to do the same thing with a statue of the Buddha, so as to carry out the practice of recollection of the Buddha, Buddhanusmrti. This is a good example of the way that during the early Common Era, many Buddhist meditation methods seem to have become more closely connected to visual imagery. The earliest Buddhist texts, for example, say that one should do this practice of recollection of the Buddha by thinking only about the Buddha's abstract qualities. For example, that the Buddha is free of desire, that he is a perfect being, and so forth. But many later sources, such as the Chinese meditation texts, say that one should do this by recollecting the Buddha's physical attributes. To return to the theme of this lecture, however, what I want to observe is that visualization meditation in this sense did not just bring the visual into meditation. It also brought meditation into the visual in a new way. When the visual had entered meditation, it also became possible for Buddhist art to more directly represent the content of meditative experience, because such experiences were now thought to be a kind of seeing. This is achieved in a somewhat basic form by this image of the skeleton from Tape Shotor. In this image, also from the Kazil grottos near Kucha along the northern Silk Roads, I think we have something even more developed in this line. Now, firstly, it's important to note what is being represented in this picture. This image is not, I would say, a painting of a monk looking at a skull. Rather, this is a painting of a monk who is meditating, and what the skull depicts is not some external object, but rather the content of the monk's mind. You can see the monk, his eyes are actually closed here, so he's not looking at this. Now, one reason for thinking this is because the ability of the meditator to focus the mind specifically on a skull without any use of an external object, that this is also something mentioned prominently in Buddhist texts. In the Sarvastivada tradition, for example, we eventually find instructions for the Ashubha Bhavana that direct the meditator to avoid using external objects. Only those with weak faculties, it is said, need to use an actual dead body. Instead, the meditator should simply imagine his own body transforming into a skeleton. And this form of the practice became known in East Asia as the so-called white bone contemplation. Moreover, some of the sources that describe this say that the first step is to imagine one's entire body as a skeleton, then to imagine many such skeletons, and then finally to reduce the vision and visualize only one's own skull. The ability to control the visual image in this way is thus said to be an indication of some kind of meditative mastery. From this point of view, the painting here is again not merely a painting of a monk trying to meditate on a skull, but rather a painting that depicts a degree of mastery of meditation. This mastery is, moreover, communicated to us, to the viewers of the image, through a direct representation of the content of the meditator's mind, the skull. rather than through any external depiction of, say, the monk's magical powers. At a certain point in Buddhist history, this notion that meditative attainment would be revealed by the presence in the mind of particular visual images seems to have become more generalized. We have evidence of this from Indian Buddhist sources, but the best and most complete examples are from Chinese sources dating to the 400s. These meditation texts are sometimes called the Dhyana Sutras, or the Chanjing, and they were either translated into Chinese at this time or perhaps partially composed or compiled in China under the influence of teachers of meditation from India or Central Asia. These texts are closely related to fragmentary Sanskrit meditation texts that were mentioned by Professor Lee a moment ago and which Professor Yamabe will be discussing in more detail later. Although these texts use the word chan or son in Korean, which is the Chinese word for dhyana, the kind of meditation they describe, just so that you know, is very, very different from what would later become the norm within the so-called Chan school or the Son school. Now, the Dhyana Sutras discuss many varieties of visualization-based Ashubha Bhavana, as well as similar visualization practices using images of the Buddha. But these texts also incorporate visual imagery into meditation in other ways. According to these texts, the attainment of advanced states of meditation, no matter what technique one uses, are revealed to the meditator by a variety of visions of concrete objects or scenes. In one of these texts, known by this name here, which was translated into Chinese in the early 400s, this is alluded to in a somewhat cryptic way as follows, and in other passages as well. When toward his meditation object the practitioner remains firm and clear, he will attain samadhi, that is, meditative attainment, separating from all confused conceptualizations and eliminating his defilements. At this time, various wondrous signs will appear, such as images of marvelous pure gems or crystal bubbles. Now, here, the content of this vision is described only briefly, but in other passages in this text, more details are given. What I want to highlight here is that these wondrous signs, as it says, are said to appear when one attains meditation based on the method of the so-called contemplation of the aggregates. Now, we don't need to know the details of this, but suffice to say that this is a well-known meditation method. But unlike the contemplation of dead bodies, which I mentioned a moment ago, this is not a method that involves concrete visualization. It is a much more abstract meditation method based on analyzing the components of one's body and mind into the so-called 5 skandhas or aggregates. In other words, we have here in this text what I think is a new idea, the idea that meditative attainment will be indicated to the meditator by a concrete vision, and that this will be so regardless of whether the technique of meditation used involves visual imagery or not. Now, some of these Dhyana Sutras are very clear that each stage of progress, each successively higher meditative attainment, will be connected to specific visions. In some sources, these attainments are arranged into numbered lists. Sometimes the visions are relatively simply described. Here is one such example. The meditation teacher should instruct the practitioner to contemplate the navel of the Buddha. If the practitioner says, "I see light emerging from the Buddha's navel, reaching the horizon in all directions, and standing in the light are numerous Buddhas," then this is the 17th thing. It's not clear what 17th thing here means, but maybe like the 17th stage. Then instruct the practitioner to contemplate the light. If he says, "I see innumerable people in the light, all experiencing happiness," then this is the 18th thing. In other sources, the visions become very elaborate. The so-called text known as the Secret Essentials of Meditation, for example, describes this vision here as part of what will indicate the attainment of the first stage of meditation. 4 yakshas suddenly spring from the ground, their eyes flaming, their tongues like poisonous snakes. Each has 6 heads, and each head is different, one like a mountain, the others like the heads of a cat, a tiger, a wolf, a dog, and a rat. Their hands are like those of an ape. The tips of each of their 10 fingers are poisonous snakes with 4 heads, spraying water, dirt, wind, and fire. Now, the Secret Essentials of Meditation, this text here, spends most of its time, most of its pages, describing visions such as this. And there are other examples that are even much more elaborate. Compared with traditional Indian Buddhist meditation texts, the emphasis in these sources is thus different. Although they present the entire path of meditation, there is little discussion of the psychological aspects of meditation. Instead, what we find is that each stage of meditation is associated with various concrete visions, such as this. Now, as the text described things, the point does not seem to be that these visions are what cause meditative attainment. Rather, it's that the occurrence of the visions is a sign of having reached meditative attainment. And for this reason, in the book, or books that I wrote about these texts, I called these visions confirmatory visions, visions that confirm or attest to one's attainment of these states. Now, some of these visions seem to have what we might call a symbolic interpretation. For example, as the meditator progresses towards awakening in this text, The Secret Essentials of Meditation, there is a recurring sequence of visions involving an enormous tree that is gradually destroyed as the meditator gets closer to awakening. We can infer that this is probably symbolizing somehow the destruction of the mental defilements, the klesha, which there are doctrinal texts that analogize them to a giant tree. Also in this text, when the meditator attains the stage of so-called stream entry, shotapana, one important stage of meditation, he has a vision of a snake with 88 heads being consumed by fire. And presumably this in some way symbolizes the doctrine that we find in some schools of Buddhism, that one becomes a stream enterer after one has eliminated 88 defilements. In these examples, stages of meditation that are more traditionally defined in terms of the psychological aspects of the meditator's inner mind, such as the destruction of particular defilements, the understanding of specific Buddhist truths, these have become objective, we might say. They are revealed by visions that are identifiable by their content, by the objects or events that occur within them. This kind of transformation of inner psychological states into concrete visions is something that, to me at least, when I first began to think about it, brings to mind Sigmund Freud's famous analysis of dreams, with which you may be familiar or at least have heard of. As Freud writes, the transformation of the subconscious mind into the dream image usually results in a colorless and abstract expression in the dream thought being exchanged for a pictorial and concrete one. The advantage and accordingly purpose of such a change jumps to the eyes. A thing that is pictorial is, from the point of view of a dream, a thing that is capable of being represented. That is, you can see it. A dream thought is unusable so long as it is expressed in an abstract form. But once it has been transformed into pictorial language, contrasts and identifications of the kind which the dream work requires and which it creates if they are not already present can be established. So in other words, for Freud, it is the pictorial quality of the dream, that it's something composed of images, not words. This makes it possible for abstract ideas or feelings, which in Freud's world, of course, are things that are hidden within the subconscious of the person, to be represented, that is to say, to become available objectively and hence publicly. For Freud, of course, this is the crucially important point. This is what allows him to interpret other people's dreams. That meditative experience in Buddhism could become objective in this same way was an important part of how it was practiced in medieval Chinese Buddhism, and we have many stories about how meditators would report the content of their visions to their teachers, who would then use the content of their visions to judge their progress. Now, another aspect of this objectivity, as I would call it, was in the domain of art. This image here, as I've already discussed, is noteworthy as an effort to represent the content of a successful meditator's mind. But the possible ways of doing this explode in a series of paintings from caves 20 and 42 of the Toyok Grottos near Turfan, also on the Silk Roads. These paintings in caves, as you can see, are in a quite fragmentary condition, but still we can more or less see clearly in them at various points in tiered registers along the walls, series of meditators, before each of whom are depicted a variety of unusual objects or visions. Some more examples of this here. They're fragmentary, so it's a bit hard to see, so we have some line drawings that art historians have made to allow us to sort of see these unusual objects in many ways. There's another examples of the meditators and their sort of strange visions or objects. Scholars, including Professor Yamabe, who will be speaking soon, and Professor Miyaji Akira, have examined these images in detail and also some of the Chinese inscriptions that accompany them, and have shown that these images are closely connected to the 5th century Dhyana Sutras, as well as to other meditation texts from this time, even though many of the images are quite obscure, and the murals do not exactly match any specific text. Professor Yamabe has also used these paintings to argue that many of the Chinese meditation texts in question may have been composed in the same area near Turfan where we find these images. What I'm interested in thinking about, however, is simply the question of what these paintings accomplish as paintings. And what I would say is that these paintings, in a way that Buddhist art had not been able to before, manage to give objective form, not just to meditative attainment, which is already no small thing, I think, but to a multiplicity of different meditative attainments. Each attainment is conveyed to the viewer by directly representing the vision seen by each meditating monk. And this is possible precisely because, according to the traditions of meditation that were popular at this time, to judge from the texts, the primary content of meditative attainment is a concrete vision of some kind. The developments in Buddhist meditation that we see in texts, which I mentioned a moment ago, have in this way created a bridge between the external artistic representation and the internal world of meditative experience. When the most important meditative experiences are visions, rather than the realization of abstract truths or the experience of psychological states, these experiences become tangible in visual form as such. And this makes it possible, as here in these paintings, to portray in art a diversity of meditative attainment. Note further how this diversity seems to go along in these images with small differences in the monks. The cut of their robes, the kind of seat they are sitting on, the style of their shoes, shown right here underneath, that gives to each image the flavor of individuality. To be clear, I don't think these are actual portraits of individual people, but the diversity of meditative visions, as described in the meditation texts, here make possible a diversity of representation of meditative attainment, and hence of the people who have such attainment. Although we can't say very much more about the function of these kinds of paintings within the Buddhist community that made them, I would personally think that one of the purposes of them must have been to suggest to viewers that the living community of monks and nuns, who outwardly maybe look all the same, might also be home to a similarly large number of people who have reached a similarly wide variety of different meditative attainments. So, to summarize then, I have suggested that over the first centuries of the Common Era, Buddhist meditative attainment was increasingly thought to be a kind of concrete visionary experience. And moreover, that these developments in Buddhist meditation theory made it possible for Buddhist artists, in a few cases at least, to depict meditative attainment in a way that had not been possible before. So here then, when meditative attainment became a kind of seeing, it also became visible in a new way. To close my talk, however, I want to leave you with a brief example of another case from the history of Buddhist art that we might possibly take in the opposite manner. That is to say, an example where by making a physical image less visible, it might have been possible to make the experience of seeing Buddhist art similar to the experience of a meditative vision. This example is unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, only known from texts and stories. So in this case, which is perhaps appropriate, I do not have an image to show you. But it is a quite famous example. This is the so-called Cave of the Buddha's Emanation. Between the 4th and 7th centuries at least, this was a famous pilgrimage site located in what is now Afghanistan. And located, and this may be a coincidence, in the same area as the monastery that had the painting of the skeleton that I showed you earlier. The Cave of the Buddha's Emanation was very well known in medieval China because many Chinese Buddhist pilgrims visited the site on their way to India and wrote about it. According to the legends about the cave, when the Buddha was alive, he had visited this cave and projected an image of himself onto its walls. This image became famous. However, it is said to have had a kind of magical quality. When people tried to make copies of the image, to draw a picture of it, somehow it was impossible to do. Our only written sources that describe the cave come from China, And they describe it using this word here, ying in the Chinese pronunciation, which is sometimes translated as shadow. So sometimes this is called the cave of the Buddha's shadow. But I prefer to translate it as emanation, since the image was supposed to be bright and luminous, not dark or shadowy. There are also some historical reasons for thinking that this cave was very well known among the people who created the 5th century meditation texts that I have been talking about. Some of these texts use this unusual term, Buddha's emanation, to describe some of the visions that one might obtain in meditation. And in another such text, we even find a version of the legend about the origins of the cave. The famous Indian translator Buddhabhadra, who has been mentioned already, who came to China at this time and who was known as a meditation teacher, was from this same region where the cave was located. Certainly, we know from historical sources that the cave had captured the imagination of Chinese Buddhists. The cave was so famous that Juhyung of Mount Lu, who was a very famous person at this time and was very interested in the practice of meditation, he is said to have tried to build some kind of replica of the cave. This replica does not survive, but we have some poems that he wrote about it. In any event, the Chinese pilgrims who visited this cave all reported that the image it contained was notable because it was in some way difficult to see. According to the Chinese monk Faxian, who was a pilgrim who visited the cave in the late 300s, one could see the image only when standing exactly 10 steps away. Walking closer, the image would disappear. Nearly 300 years later, Xuanzang, famous Xuanzang, reports that the image had become even more difficult to see, with most people only being able to see at best a very faint image. But, Xuanzang added, if one makes an earnest prayer, sometimes there is a divine response that allows one to see the image for a brief moment. A more dramatic story is told in Xuanzang's biography. Here it said that Xuanzang, when he arrived at the cave, was told that the image would be visible if you stood in the right location. But even standing in the correct location, he couldn't see it. So I suppose for Xuanzang, it looked like this, a blank wall. But Xuanzang then chanted sutras and made prostrations, which caused a faint light to appear on the cave wall. He then made a vow, and he said, I will not leave this spot until I see the Buddha's emanation. After more prayers, a complete image appeared to him in all its glory. And some, but not all, of the other people who were with him could also see it. Now, the question about how this cave of the Buddha's emanation and its image were actually constructed in the real world, this is not something I think that we can answer, although scholars have sometimes speculated about it. What I want to observe here merely by way of closing is that in these stories, the so-called Buddha's emanation behaves both like a real image, a real physical image located at a specific place in the world and connected to some kind of material substrate, but also like a meditative vision. It appears only under the right conditions, only after sufficiently devoted practice. In other words, this image was a physical image, the seeing of which was nevertheless like a meditative vision, more like a meditative vision than like ordinary vision. So to conclude, during the first centuries of the Common Era, Buddhist meditation texts began to claim that the most significant meditative experiences were visions of concrete images or texts. And this, I have suggested, made such experiences objective. They could be both analyzed by others and also represented in art in a new way. The stories about the so-called cave of the Buddha's emanation suggest that the association between visual imagery and meditative experience also sometimes went in the other direction. In the cave of the Buddha's emanation, this idea was harnessed to create an image. Maybe you can see it now. An image that precisely because it was not objective in the sense of always being available, was for this reason of great power and attractiveness. At the same time that meditative experiences came to be thought about as visions, the experience of seeing Buddhist art could also be thought about as a kind of meditative experience. Thank you.